Today is May 8th, 2024. My guest is oncologist and professor of epidemiology, Vinay Prasad of the University of California, San Francisco. This is Vinay's fifth appearance on EconTalk. He was last here in August of 2023 talking about cancer screening. Both of his 2023 appearances made the top 10 of your favorite episodes of last year. Vinay, welcome back to EconTalk.
Russ, thank you for having me. And it's such a treat to hear that the listeners like those episodes.
Yeah, they were awesome. Our topic for today is the COVID vaccine, and in particular, a recent paper of yours in the Monash Bioethical Review, co-written with Alison Haslam, that we will link to. Title of that paper is COVID-19 Vaccines, History of the Pandemic's Great Scientific Success and Flawed Policy Implementation. Before we dive in, I want to observe that it remains surreal to me that the very issue of vaccines has somehow become a huge area of discussion, a lightning rod. Much of it seems to be, if not fact-free, cherry-picked by lots of average people, not experts, but some experts too. And somehow it's become such a big issue. Does this seem strange to you? Could you have imagined this drama in advance of how it's played out? You know, if someone said to you, well, you know, it's going to be really controversial and people are going to lie and exaggerate and ignore key facts. Is it strange to you?
It is strange to me, Russ. You know, there's something about vaccines that has captured people's attention and interest and perhaps even ire for, the last 30, 40 years. There's long been a movement, I think, in America and globally skeptical of vaccines, particularly childhood immunization. And maybe that has something to do with the fact that it's injected. If they were all tablets, that might have been different, Maybe it has something to do with the fact of the age with which these vaccines are typically administered. For whatever reason, I think it has captured some small group of people's interest for a long time. But the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, naturally expanded that group. I mean, naturally, we were making policy decisions and scientific decisions, which we're going to talk about today. Some good, some not so good, some self-inflicted wounds, I think, by policymakers. Some mistakes were made. And I think that naturally was just pouring kerosene on something that had been smoldering for a while, which is sort of a skeptical anti-vaccine sentiment. But you're totally right. There's so many things we do in medicine that don't capture people's interests, like, giving kids Tylenol or acetaminophen, or giving kids, ibuprofen or something like that when they're sick, or all the things we do, in pediatrics. But for some reason, vaccines has always gotten people's attention. Yeah.
I think you're right about the injection part. And I think it's important to point out, or at least clarify, tell me if I have this right. Traditionally, vaccines are an example of the dose makes the poison, right? You get a little bit of the disease and your body immobilizes your body's natural immune system to fight the recurrence. And yet this vaccine, there were different variations of it for COVID, but the most important ones were not of that nature. Correct, and therefore you weren't giving yourself a dose of the disease. You're doing something else. Turned out that may have been challenging, but it didn't have that emotional, I think, unintuitive for many people idea that, hey, give yourself some disease for your own good.
It's a really interesting observation. I think you're right that, as far back as the days of Edward Jenner, vaccines have always been either a weakened version of the virus, a weakened cousin of the virus, a weakened viral strain or a lower dose, something to expose you to, what was potentially harmful without the harm, so that you would build immunity so that when you came across it in everyday life, you would have some resilience against it. This vaccine in a number of ways is different, of course. I mean, we'll talk about, there's a couple different platforms. Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, which actually was withdrawn from global market yesterday, are both adenoviral vector vaccines using DNA. And then the most novel formulations were the mRNA vaccines of Moderna and Pfizer. And those are probably the ones that have maybe created the most, I think, discussion, perhaps because they are new. But also there are some concerning safety signals across all these products. Oh, and I use that jargon again, so maybe you're going to want to unpack that.
Yeah, right. No, you unpack it.
safety signal. Russell and I were just talking before, and he said, in your guys' line of work, when you say safety signal, what you mean is there's something concerning there. It's a harm. And actually, yes, that's what we mean. Like, I think typically we refer to these things as safety signals when you discover some untoward adverse event, something you didn't expect, you didn't want, linked to these vaccines. And those really do play an important role in policy. And I think the big policy blunders around COVID-19 vaccination were not taking those signals serious enough, fast enough, and not acting upon them. So we can get into that.
Well, let's start with the opening line of your paper, quote, "The COVID-19 vaccine has been a miraculous, life-saving advance offering staggering efficacy in adults and was developed with astonishing speed." That is the good news. And it certainly is an opening, close quote, before I said that's the good news. That certainly is an answer to anyone who might say, well, Vinay Prasad is anti-vaccine. You're not anti-vaccine. And so talk about what was impressive and good about this rollout.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that I frame it intentionally this way because I think it's the truth. I think this is something that people don't fully admit. One, President Donald Trump launched Operation Warp Speed, which was a sort of economic program to expedite these vaccines to market. And what the government did was offered to essentially incur the risk of all the pharmaceutical firms. We will aid you, we will provide guidance, and we will sustain any losses you take if these vaccines are unsuccessful. That coordination, I think, was remarkably successful. Even the optimists weren't bullish enough at the speed with which the vaccine could be developed and deployed. We had a positive press release for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines in November of 2021. And keep in mind, in January, we were barely starting to sequence the virus itself. So, all within one calendar year. I think that's a remarkable story about vaccine development. And the next thing I want to make is, and this is something that I think is really sort of clear from the evidence, is that if you were a 70-year-old person, an 80-year-old person, a 60-year-old person with medical problems, if you had not already had COVID-19, and you got that vaccine in January of 2021, where millions of people globally did, that vaccine remarkably lowered your risk of severe disease and death from COVID-19. And we know that because the randomized controlled trials, particularly the one by Moderna, showed a huge reduction in severe disease from COVID-19 from having received the vaccine. So I think there's some extreme skeptics out there who say the vaccine did more harm than good in all age groups. The vaccine was, a scientific bungle. It saved many lives. Some of the estimates I think are maybe misleading. Maybe they're estimates, they're kind of speculation. But there's no doubt about it. If you were an older, unimmune person and you got that vaccine in first quarter of 2021, you had a remarkable reduction in severe disease and death as a result. Certainly, randomized trials have shown the severe disease part, and some observational data has shown the death part. And that's a very good thing. And it did aid in ending the pandemic. By that, I mean, COVID-19 will continue to spread. It didn't stop the spread. We can talk about that. I think, and there's some policy errors around the messaging around that. However, it remarkably reduced the death toll. And there are many people alive as a result of these vaccines who otherwise would not be had we not developed them.
We interviewed Gregory Zuckerman on his book about the creation of the vaccine, which we'll link to. I've talked about how I think I was 65 when the vaccine came out, or maybe 66. I think 66. And of course, I was over 65, which meant I had a higher risk of COVID, which, it's one of those weird things where it's really not discrete. It's a continuous effect. And it also depended a lot on your general health. I was generally healthy, while, as listeners know, a little more heavy than I wish I otherwise were. I don't have the worst kind of comorbidities that COVID-19 wreaked havoc with. Despite that, at that point, most of us were living in what felt like the Middle Ages and the bubonic plague. We felt danger all around us. I remember vividly going to the grocery store and putting my hands in Ziploc bags that I brought from home, touching things, on the handle of the cart, going through the groceries. I remember with horror when the cashier helped me bag the groceries with unwashed unknown hands touching my cans and probably washing them in the early days. And when I got that first dose, as I've said here before, I felt like Superman. I felt like other than kryptonite, which I didn't think was around, I had suddenly beaten the demon of COVID. I did occasionally remember I was still mortal, but I felt immortal there for the opening, even with only with one dose. So it was a remarkable and I think a generally a wonderful thing. So what's wrong? That's all great. What went wrong?
Well, many things went wrong. I think that's all the good stuff, and I think it's important to acknowledge the good stuff as we get into the things that we did wrong. Because I think there are some people who are quick to dismiss criticism of the vaccine in any form as sort of a blanket, sort of anti-vaccine sentiment, as you articulated. Now, what are the things we got wrong? I mean, just a short list. One, the rhetoric around whether or not the vaccine could halt transmission was incorrect and misleading. Number two, in the randomized controlled trials that led to vaccine approval, we could have explicitly tested whether or not the vaccine slowed or halted transmission. We did not do so. Number three, we started really well with older, unimmune people, but we quickly made the mistake of extrapolating our vaccine advice to people who had already had and recovered from COVID-19, an extrapolation that lacked evidence, an extrapolation that sort of ran counter to a longstanding medical tradition of thinking that having had and recovered from a disease does confer some sort of durable immunity, particularly against the severe manifestations of that disease. So we extrapolated that advice incorrectly. Number four, we pushed this in younger and younger populations, often using the brute force of the state and the schools to mandate this, even into populations where the risk and benefit balance were more tenuous and uncertain. Number five, we started to discover safety signals. In other words, there were harms of this vaccine. The governments were reluctant to admit those harms. They delayed interrogating those harms, and they failed to act upon those harms. And those harms did not fall equally across the age distribution. In many cases, those harms fell disproportionately among the people with the least to gain, the youngest people. One of those harms is inflammation of the heart, myocarditis. That's a harm that particularly affects young men between the ages of 16 and 22. The risk of that was massive. The Israeli experience, which we can talk about, where the first estimates were 1 in 3,000, and the second dose of vaccine of the mRNA vaccines. That risk of myocarditis far exceeded the potential benefit of those doses on severe disease. So in other words, that's a roundabout way of saying I'm fairly confident for some populations, we actually started to inflict a net harm on these groups of people by recommending and mandating dose after dose after dose. And then the last thing is children. I think the evidence is quite weak, particularly children who have had COVID-19. And then finally, the benefits of a annual or biannual perpetual vaccine policy, which is in the United States right now. We have essentially at least once a year, possibly every 2 times a year in certain age groups, vaccination for COVID-19 in perpetuity till the end of time. What's the evidence for that? And so this paper, which is a very lengthy policy paper, about 22 pages, talks about all of this stuff. And then one last point I want to make. It talks about all this stuff, but the last point I want to make is we should talk about the initial vaccine approval. It came out after the election. Why did it come out after the election, not before the election, when Trump was saying it was going to come before the election? Was that based on science or was that based on politics? And I think that's the first most provocative part of this paper. And I think that's your listeners might find that interesting.
Yeah. Let's go back to the first thing you mentioned, the transmission.
Yes.
It's a classic argument in economics. The technical term is externalities, the idea being that if you don't vaccinate, you're imposing costs on people who might have very high costs of getting vaccinated themselves relative to yourself. And therefore, even though it's your risk in your life, you might be exposing others to the dangers of the disease, others who cannot protect themselves or whose the cost of protecting them is very high for health reasons. And this argument was made over and over again in the early days of the COVID-19 vaccine that a mandate was as you argue, the argument was it was ethical. It was justified because you needed to help old people and potentially children, although here in this case it wasn't true. But the argument, say, in other vaccines would be, well, you might think, well, it's just up to you, but no, if you don't vaccinate, you're putting elderly and children at risk where it's very costly to vaccinate them, health-wise costs. And you argue that's not true. Is that true at the beginning or just when the Omicron variant came out?
Yeah, so I think by the Omicron variant, which really sort of came out by the fourth quarter of 2021, clearly had vaccine escape, i.e. that no matter how many doses you'd gotten in the past, you could get Omicron through that, and you could spread Omicron through that. However, it was known as early as the summer of 2021 in the United States from places like Provincetown, Massachusetts, where they had a sort of annual gathering of many men, 97% of whom had been vaccinated, but many of whom came down with COVID-19, that even some of the earlier strains could spread despite vaccination. So in other words, I think we knew pretty early on that vaccinated people could get COVID-19 even after being vaccinated, that the vaccine would not be able to halt transmission. But I want to make one more point about the trial. I mean, one of the points that I think we don't talk enough about is that all global economies are put on hold. I mean, the pandemic has, as you say, it was like living in the plague. I mean, it has changed the lives of so many people. Governments are spending tens of trillions of dollars globally on pandemic, economic relief, and on all the sequela of having diminished economic productivity. So in other words, this is a huge global event. We run the randomized control trial, and it would not have cost them much more, and it would have been infinitely logical to do the following. In this Pfizer study, they take 40,000 people, we divide them in two groups, half get the vaccine, half don't. And we measure how many of those people feel like they have symptoms of COVID-19. We test them for COVID-19. That's the study design. The study could have also been powered and designed to look at things. I think some of the critics are correct to say, how come you didn't run a study in older people and actually look at all-cause mortality as an endpoint? Could have done that. They could have run a different study in just over age of 80, and the endpoint could have been all-cause mortality. And how come you didn't take your big study and basically say, for of these 20,000 people in one arm, we're going to say, we'll sample 5,000 people and test every one of their family members every week for COVID-19 to see, does it actually slow the spread? Not only are they less likely to get COVID, are they less likely to spread it to their family members? And you could have analyzed that in a randomized study. And it would have cost a little bit of money. But in comparison to what we're spending on this, it's literally a drop in the ocean. That to me is a missed maneuver. And I worry that, that there's a reason why the company doesn't want to do that, obviously, because there's very overwhelming chance that it doesn't do that. And that would sort of undermine, one of the claims of the vaccine. But to me, it's very concerning that policymakers like at US FDA, at CDC, in the White House, and in EMA, that they didn't make the company generate those data. That's a huge missed opportunity. And I think many of us said that at the time. And I think I really don't see much justification for not doing that kind of study. Yeah.
And given that the government was subsidizing the creation of the vaccine, guaranteeing enormous purchases, which was probably a good idea, but they extracted nothing in return for that, which could have been incredibly inexpensive relative to the profitability of the product. Two things. First, this issue about transmission. The people who took the vaccine and then still were able to spread the disease, the vaccine could still have been effective. You're saying it didn't keep them from getting the disease. It kept them from getting a more dangerous version of the disease. Their symptoms were reduced, even though they still had it. And therefore, they could pass it on to others very easily. Is that the key distinction there?
Absolutely. That, in order to benefit you, all I need the vaccine to do is reduce the likelihood that I'm going to die of COVID-19 or be have the breathing tube put down my throat from COVID-19, which I think these vaccines do. Particularly, I think they do that in people who have not already had COVID-19. Okay. The next thing is, does it work so well that it actually prevents me from ever even catching a milder version of this? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't. That has different policy implications. That has implications for passports, for mandates, but not for the personal health question. So I think two things are true: that the 80-year-old who rushed to get it was making a wise choice, But compelling the 20-year-old to get it to protect the 80-year-old was an unwise policy decision and has huge ramifications for trust in public health and for trust in vaccines. And I'll just make one more nuanced point to the listener, which is that one thing that was also unclear was that if the 80-year-old gets the shot and we compel the 20-year-old to get the shot on top of that, does that further reduce the 80-year-old's likelihood of death beyond the benefit they're getting from the personal receipt of the vaccine? And that was something that policymakers did not do a great job of studying. It was sort of this idea that I think they had this sort of fantastical idea that we could literally extinguish this virus and sort of make it extinct by vaccinating everybody. That had sort of no basis and also runs counter to what we know about coronavirus, which is that there are four circulating endemic strains of coronavirus, and we all get them over and over again in our lives. It's not the kind of thing you get once and you never get again. It mutates, it changes, and then you get it again a few years later, which is what's going to happen with COVID-19. We're going to keep getting it again and again, every few years, as long as humanity persists, I think.
Well, you mentioned the 20-year-old. I think what was even worse was was smaller children, the closing of schools, because the argument was, we'll keep the kids out of school, the 9-year-old, because that way they won't be able to infect their grandparents when they go to visit. Was that part of, do you think that was a mistake?
Oh, absolutely. School closure was one of the greatest policy blunders, particularly in the United States, domestic policy blunders, I think, of the last quarter century. Let's just put it in perspective. Only one nation, to my knowledge, was brave enough to keep schools open the entire time. That was Sweden. And they did that predominantly in kids under the age of 12. They never closed. Most of Western Europe, I think, was pretty good about it. They closed for 6 weeks to 12 weeks, something in that ballpark, places like Germany and Spain and Switzerland. But then they reopened quickly by fall of 2020. The United States, to my knowledge, is one place where schools were closed in San Francisco from March of 2020 until the fall of 2021. We're talking about 18 months of school closure in urban enclaves like Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. And this was a catastrophic policy decision. Huge, we see through all the test score data, huge decreases in learning among these kids, often poor minority kids, who potentially have the most to lose from having school closure. And the justification was that this school closure protected grandma and grandpa. We've had a couple of really nice economic analyses on this topic, including one from the University of Southern California researchers and the policy school there, including some from Germany using a natural experiment of staggered school closures in the summer of 2020. And the economists who've analyzed this rigorously some studies find no decrease in community transmission from closing schools. That's the German study. And some find a very, very marginal difference in transmission that's unlikely to, have made a big impact in the in COVID-19 dynamics. That's the USC conclusion. But I think most people believe that it didn't accomplish the stated aims. It didn't slow transmission to grandma, grandpa, or it did so only very marginally. The kids had nothing to worry about anyway, because most of them in the United States and elsewhere globally got COVID-19 without having gotten vaccination eventually, and most of them did very well. This is thankfully a disease that does not kill children the way influenza does. And the loss to children was catastrophic in terms of learning losses and grade losses. And economists will know that will have spillover effects on livelihood, employment, and lifespan. That's the thing that I think the epidemiologists just did not understand. They were so singularly focused on COVID-19, they didn't understand that not going to school and losing 2 years of learning loss can shorten someone's life. And that to me was, I think one of the big blunders.
And some might be tempted to say, well, but it's worth it to save some of the elderly or some of the grandmas and grandpas. Being a grandfather now, which I was not in the time of COVID, I would happily accept the risk of a higher chance of COVID in return for my granddaughter having a better life. And I think it's very hard for people to think in those terms, those kind of trade-offs. Maybe not every grandparent would have felt that way. I think many would have, maybe most, if not all. And I wonder if the next time we have something like this, whether that will be the response if we encounter a disease with this incredibly strong differential impact on on populations based on age. When you talk about the trial of Pfizer, the 40,000, and you said we could have made them do a richer trial analysis and find out, what the cost benefits were for different age groups. Was that what you said?
Yeah, that's one point. And we could have tested transmission directly, so we
Right.
would have known.
Test that directly. Now it's true that you have come out and said that they're ex post, ex ante at the time. Do you think was there a loud outcry for that policy? And I ask because it's tempting to say that Pfizer's political influence insulated them from that request. It could have been just an error on the part of policymakers. It could have been a disagreement about what was important. There could be a lot of reasons. At the time, were people demanding it in medicine?
Yeah,
in epidemiology.
So I think it's a fair point, and I often people say that a lot of your criticism is ex post, but what did you say at the time? And for a while on my Twitter page, I had a pinned post of every op-ed, video, and podcast I did in real time to show that many of these were my policy positions at the time, not just after the fact. To this particular question, there was a New York Times op-ed written by Peter Doshi, and I believe it came out in the fall of 2020 prior to the vaccine announcement, and it specifically said, we ought to design and power these studies for severe disease, not merely having symptomatic COVID-19. And then privately, I will tell you that many of us were discussing this. So I think that was something that was said. Now, what was said on the other side? Look, there are many things that we could have done differently in the original studies. One is, did we really need a study from 18 to 100? Could we have done, separate studies, like studies in, randomized trial in nursing homes powered for mortality, randomized trial from 60 to 80 powered for severe disease, randomized trial in 40 to 60 looking at transmission and looking at symptomatic COVID-19, and then the last randomized trial from 18 to 40 looking at symptomatic transmission, severe disease, and death. But here's one distinction. When you start to break it out by age groups in multiple studies, studies can halt at different times. We have one study, and the moment it halts, everybody on the control arm gets the vaccine. So essentially, detecting safety signals is washed. Detecting whether or not the vaccine starts to lose efficacy with time is lost because everyone's getting it. But if you have different cohorts from 18 to 40, you can run that randomized trial for 6 months or 8 months or a year. That vaccine does not need to be made available as soon as 80-year-olds. In fact, there's a supply constraint anyway. Even if you were to approve it, you don't have enough vaccine for 18-year-olds and 80-year-olds. You got to get the 80-year-olds first. So why not design these studies in a way we get more and more information, more and more safety information? Now, it's easy to say that this is all in retrospect, but I think these are principles of medicine that are longstanding, and people knew that at the time. The cynical answer is that the company, of course, has very little incentive to do these studies. The longer you run the study without crossing people over, the more likely it is that people start to find that more and more safety concerns are linked to your product. And then there's also, I think, the good intention, which is that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. People want sort of a one-size-fits-all. Yeah, we're all concerned. We're panicking. We just want a one-size-fits-all solution, a single vaccine study, 18 and up. Let's just get it done and just vaccinate everyone and, let the chips fall where they may. I think that's also part of the calculus. I would say that, one of the things that my essay did was talk about attitudes about vaccine. And I think that's very interesting. And I'll make a brief mention. I went through many, many news stories and I documented what were the news outlets saying about vaccination by calendar year. And there's a table of quotes in 2020. And the quote said, and you have to remember the context, Trump is on television every day. And he's saying things like, the vaccine's going to be marvelous. You're going to get it. It's going to be wonderful. And it's going to come out before the election. Everything will go away. Like these kinds of very tall claims. He's running in an election year. He's saying these things. Many people are writing op-eds saying, be careful. Just because a vaccine is approved doesn't mean it's going to work. Be careful. Even if it increases antibodies, doesn't mean it actually reduces the risk of dying. Be careful. Some vaccines in the past have actually increased the risk of getting the virus. Be careful. Vaccines can have safety signals that take years to be known. So maybe we shouldn't rush into this. The scientists are just publishing a steady stream of this. The moment Biden wins the election. The same scientists, they switch 180 and then they say the vaccines, they came out, that nothing to worry about. Safety signal is pristine. I've never seen data this good. I've highlighted these quotes in my essay. I worry that some of it is politically motivated, and that troubles me. And then the final thing I'll say is Pew has public opinion polling on vaccination from May of 2020 till the election. The public opinions on vaccines cratered. I mean, this negative rhetoric in the media space in 2020, the election year, absolutely destroyed Americans' desire to take a COVID-19 vaccine. That's been documented by Pew. And then 2021, when Biden is in office, was an attempt to, I think, resurrect that and try to get people to take what they had already spent a whole year dissuading you of. Okay, then the last thing I want to say, Russ, about the timing of the approval. You know, Trump many times said that this vaccine will be available before the election. And I don't think he said that because of his usual bombastic nature. I think he said that because he was told that that was likely to be the case. And let me explain why he felt that was likely to be the case and what actually happened. When you run a randomized control trial, or any randomized control trial that's blinded, where you don't know who got the vaccine and who got the placebo, you have to make decisions on when do you look at the data the first time. And basically what you do is you randomize people to vaccine or placebo. The primary endpoint of this study is symptomatic SARS-CoV-2, meaning people have to say, I have a runny nose, I have a sore throat, and then we swab them. And then we mail that swab to Pfizer, who's running genetic testing on it. And if they find COVID-19, that's scored as an endpoint, 1, 2, 3. So as the trial is running, people say, I feel sick, I feel sick. They swab them. And Pfizer is running this like, oh, we have 1 positive, 2 positive, 3 positive. But they're blinded. They don't know which arm of the study they are. But once they have 32 positive results, they have to take, this is the original statistical plan, called for at 32 positive results, we're going to look at the data the first time. We'll look. And if the ratio of the positive results is 26 in one arm and 6 in the other arm, it's a winner. If it's 27.5, 28, and 4, it's a success. If it's if it's anything less than 26.6, if it's 25.7, trial keeps going, right? So this is called the stopping boundary. An extremely skewed imbalance in those swabs could stop the study at 32 events. That's the original statistical plan. And Pfizer knows how many swabs are coming in each week and how many are testing positive. And Trump knows that too. So I think Trump was very confident it'll come out in October because he knows, Pfizer tells him, with the rate which these are testing positive, we'll hit 32 by mid-October. I think that's what Pfizer is telling the Trump team privately. And that's why he's so bullish about it coming out in October. Now, here's where it gets interesting. There's a huge movement among academic doctors, epidemiologists, and the press and everybody who doesn't like Trump, okay. I mean, that's everybody in most of the elites, I think. They didn't want him to have it. Okay, they didn't want him to have it. So they tried many ways to delay that first look. One was asking for, a minimum of 2 months safety data rather than a median of 2 months safety data. This was a proposal that didn't make a lot of sense scientifically. Ultimately, under extreme pressure, Pfizer altered the statistical plan of the study and changed the 32 look to 64 look. They made a protocol amendment to change the first look and increase the number of events. The stated reason is that this would increase the statistical confidence that the result is valid, but that's incorrect because at 64 events, less of a skew is required to trigger the stopping rule. One can imagine at 1,000 events, if it's 550 and 450, we stop. But at 32 events, you need a huge skew, 26.6, you know what I mean? A bigger difference. They changed the statistical plan in October, and they did not do so, in my opinion, for any credible scientific reason. It was only to delay the time until they got the report and could stop the study. And then there is some reporting in Stat that Borla himself suggested that they slow down on testing those swabs coming in to further kind of delay it. And coincidentally, they took the first look at something like 90 some events, which occurred right after the election. And then they put out the press release like a few days after the election. So the argument that I made in the essay, which I think some will find controversial, but I think is true, is that there was no medical or scientific reason to not look at 32 events, to change the protocol. Changing protocol always, I think, is a problem in statistical plans. It's better to stick with what you started than keep altering it. It was done, I think, almost entirely politically motivated. And I think it actually killed people because that delay of even a few weeks in the peak of Delta wave will result in a delay of immunization at the most critical time. And so I think this is something that few people recognize, but I think historians will recognize that as an incredible, incredible policy blunder.
Very interesting. I think there are people in the world who think that public health officials are merely scientists looking for the truth. There are people who think that, but no one would actually be so naive to think that the head of, say, a pharmaceutical company, you mentioned it, the head of Pfizer, his name is
Albert Bourla.
Bourla. So that was the reference you made. I think most people understand that there's a conflict of interest there. The head of a CEO of a pharmaceutical company in the American system has a profit motive at stake, which is both what is fabulous about our system and not always fabulous, the American system. And yet somehow we have this romance about a doctor in a government role. Really what you're suggesting is that they too respond to incentives. I like to think that if there is another pandemic in our near future, and these lessons are remembered, that a serious scientist in a leadership role in the public health system would remember the kind of lessons you're talking about and respond differently, but maybe not.
Yeah, I think while it's nice to think of public health officials and epidemiologists as impartial, I think many studies show that they're extremely left-leaning. And then while it's nice to think of science as separate from politics, I think science and politics have always been intertwined. And then I think the final point is that Trump is a uniquely triggering figure. I think we underestimate, but I mean, I work at University of California, San Francisco. Suffice it to say that the faculty here are not the biggest Trump supporters. Throughout the Trump administration, I think we routinely saw faculty, he really knows how to get under people's skin. In part, that might be his appeal to his own base, is that he angers the people that they don't like. But I think that to me, it's absolutely incredible that you could let this guy rattle you and get these policy decisions wrong. I think there's two examples. One is the schools. There's very good public opinion polling data in the United States that at the end of June, many Americans, the American Association of Pediatrics, the teachers' unions, were all calling for school reopening. Trump famously gives a speech at the end of June or early July of 2020, where he says in the fall, all the schools have to reopen. The same public opinion data shows a huge swing in sentiment about school reopening. The AAP revises their position. They actually go against children. I think it's naive to think that these organizations did not also suffer from, I think, what some call Trump derangement syndrome, where you literally say the sun rises in the west just because he said it rises in the east. You're so triggered by him, you can't focus on what matters. And I think school closure in the United States, many data show, it was linked to whether or not it had a strong teachers union, whether or not the city was democratically controlled, but it was not linked to the spread of COVID-19, the cases of COVID-19 and hospitalization of COVID-19. And Republican districts reopened much sooner, to their credit. That to me is a problem. I say that as somebody who, as I said before on this podcast, who considers himself progressive and progressive ideals at heart, which is that as a progressive, I believe that championing poor minority children and their education and their health is the number one value of progressives, even ahead of, and I think most cultures value children ahead of adults and elderly. And to give that up because Trump said it was literally cutting your nose to spite your face. I think that was terrible.
Yeah, well, good thing he's out of off. Oh, I forgot he's running again. And we'll have the same kind of challenges, I think, in policy. I've said this before in the program, maybe even to you. I have vivid memories of him coming out on stage in the early days of the pandemic, unmasked, standing cheek to jowl with 8 other members of the administration. And by the way, they don't look happy. They're not keeping 6 feet apart from each other. They're grim. And you could say they're grim because they were in a pandemic, but I think part of the reason they're grim is that they've got to sit there and listen to their boss. And he's doing it in a way, he's speaking unmasked and close to everybody. And I believe, maybe there's even evidence for this, but I certainly believe that mask attitudes were driven by whether you liked or did not like Mr. Trump. In particular, help me out here. In California, there are still people wearing masks.
Oh, yeah.
who are
They
not
do.
protesting and trying to maintain anonymity in a anti-Israel protest. It's just a social signal. I'm worried, and I'm showing you that I care about you. So I'm wearing a mask, which means you cannot look at my face very well, cannot read my mouth, and connect to me as another human being. I found that cost of the pandemic to be non-trivial in our human relations with each other, and yet it became an incredibly intense fight, again akin to vaccines, over what should have been a mere factual matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the more Trump didn't wear it, the more liberals said we got to wear it twice as hard.
Yeah.
And organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics were deranged, in my opinion, recommending it to 2-year-olds and using the power of the state to compel it. That was Biden's Head Start program, compelling it in a 3-year-old, where literally, as a really famous researcher told me once, he's like, this is one space where you don't even need to know anything about the literature. You just need your eyes to know that making a 2-year-old wear a cloth mask is the dumbest thing on planet Earth. So that's one. And two, you're absolutely right. In liberal strongholds in the US, there are, of course, you see it in the protesters, but even outside of that, there are many people who still mask to this day in San Francisco because they are maybe personally worried. And I think that's also, and that's not the case if you go to Texas, for instance, rural Texas. You don't see any of that. So it is falling by political lines.
But since you and I both care about the truth,
yeah,
and have no political biases whatsoever, either of us, what I was trying to hint at there, not hint at, but imply, is that I was very pro-mask in the very opening days of the pandemic. I thought it was a low-cost, prudent thing to do is to wear a mask, which is why I was upset that Trump did not wear one. But as the pandemic wore on, and as it was clear that there was this human cost of interaction, especially for children, I found it incredibly painful that children would be looking both at each other, at other children, and at their parents and grandparents without fully seeing their faces. Was that an evidence-based feeling that was wrong? I mean, what have we learned about masks that's true? I really don't know, because many would argue, and I'm going to defend the left-leaning folks both of us are talking about, who I'm accusing of being virtue signalers. Isn't it better safe than sorry?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot to say there. I mean, what does the evidence show? Well, we could start with the pre-pandemic evidence was that generally community. I think the one thing to draw a distinction is that masks, people, it's not like it's many different interventions. Mask wearing is like the ICU doctor going into the COVID-19 patient's room. Should he wear an N95? That's one question. The question I think most of us care about is the community question, which is, should people in the community be advised or mandated to wear masks? Should those masks be cloth masks, surgical masks, or N95 masks? And how low do you go in terms of age? Do you take that down to, say, 8-year-olds or 6-year-olds or 2-year-olds as in the United States? I think those, to me, are the more interesting policy questions. The evidence pre-pandemic was pretty conclusive that randomized studies of community masking were generally negative and did not appear to work. And that's why Fauci famously said, on 60 Minutes in middle of March, you don't need to wear one. You might be touching your face and doing something else that has a countervailing benefit. Then, of course, I think there was an activist campaign in the United States to recommend it. And I actually didn't disagree with them too much, because I think you could say, listen, out of an abundance of caution, out of prudence, we don't know, just let's do this, let's try. What I do think is also another evidence generation failure that governments like the United States and all of Europe, well, with one exception, Denmark, we didn't run any studies to actually try to figure it out. We didn't run cluster randomized trials. We didn't try to figure out if we actually got the policy right. And then at some point, very quickly, by the summer of 2020, it was so politically polarized that I think nobody wanted to generate the evidence. If you generated that evidence in a well-done study, one side is going to be right and one side is going to be wrong. And that's going to have tremendous political implications. And I think it was actively thwarted. I know personally, like from, anecdotally, that there were some discussion of trying to do it in places like the United Kingdom, but there were some staunch people who thought they already knew the answer, who didn't want those studies to be conducted. I certainly think that right now, my personal opinion is that when I see people in the store wearing it, when I see somebody on an airplane making a 18-month-old baby wear a flow mask, which I saw recently on an airplane, I think that I think that's crazy. And I think that, like, I mean, enforcing a child to wear, even your own child to wear a mask in 2024, I think those parents need someone to talk to them at a minimum and tell them that that doesn't make a lot of sense. And in many ways, I think it's cruel. And you would have said that to somebody in 2019 if you saw them masking their kid like that in an airplane. You would have said, "What are you doing to your child? This is a kid, man." But now somehow we don't go there. So I think we've talked about masks before on a prior episode, but yeah, I mean, I think now we have the new Cochrane review, and again, the new Cochrane review is pretty negative. There were only 3 randomized trials run globally during the pandemic: Guinea-Bissau, Bangladesh, and Denmark. They all have limitations, and I don't think they really moved the needle forward on the evidence base that much. I mean, I think we're sort of left in the same place, and that's what the meta-analysis suggests too.
When I see people out in public now wearing the masks, which, by the way, I almost never see here in Israel and see in some numbers in the United States when I'm traveling there, I try to give those folks the benefit of the doubt. I assume they have perhaps some serious condition that this gives them comfort. But the other thing I want to say is that, when the disease first started, we were first aware of it. We weren't sure much about how it was transmitted. We weren't sure much about it. And I remember you alluded to, I remember people saying, just don't touch your face, and you really reduce your risk of the disease. And Fauci had said, and we've talked about this before on the program, that I think he was trying to reserve masks for healthcare officials. So he was discouraging public use at the time. I wish he had instead encouraged prices to solve that problem. But put that to the side. People said, just don't touch your face. And, I started looking at how often people touch their face. I'm touching my face now. It's almost impossible for a human being to not touch their face. It's just an interesting thing that I learned from the pandemic. But the point is that we learned fairly quickly that it was airborne. And so why wouldn't masks help a little bit? What was the reason that we now are so skeptical? Just on common sense grounds. Randomized controlled trials are difficult. People do other things. They don't wear them all the time. They don't wear them correctly, et cetera. Given that it's airborne, why wouldn't caution be more effective there?
I mean, I think that the sort of the mechanistic reasons are, like, do I think it's possible that it has a small benefit? Sure, but maybe it gets washed away with everyday life. For instance, if we go in a room for 30 seconds each, and you have COVID and I don't have COVID, and we could have done these studies too, these challenge studies, which people didn't do that many of, but we could have put 2 people in a room for 30 seconds, and neither of us are masked. I think there's a certain probability I get COVID-19, and if I wear a cloth mask, if you wear a cloth mask, I don't know, maybe it goes down a little bit. But now let's change it from 30 seconds to 1 minute to 2 minutes to 8 hours. That's when I think you start to get into the real world. So if 2 people are working in an office side by side for 8 hours in the same stagnant pool of air, does the cloth mask still have a benefit? And at some point, you got to think that, okay, this air has, all the particles are circulating for the last 2 hours here. And eventually some of it's slipping through your mask, even if you think masks have benefits. I mean, that's one mechanistic reason. The other mechanistic reason is if we're working in the office for 8 hours together, eventually I'm going to take a sip of coffee. You're going to have a drink. It's going to slip down. Or the mask becomes soggy, or it's not filtering as much as you think it filters. And, all these sorts of mechanistic reasons. But ultimately, I think the beauty of sort of the bigger studies is that it accounts for all those things: how people use it, behavioral compliance, time in the room. One of the things about the pediatric requirement in the U.S. was the kids in daycare had to wear the cloth mask. These kids who are like learning facial cues and talking, except for the 2 hours where they all lay on mats next to each other napping in the same room. Then they have to take it off because it's a suffocation risk, which to me is, who is setting that policy? You have to literally be the dumbest person I've ever. And and the CDC set that policy, and then sometimes they have the gall to say, who are these people questioning us, and why don't people trust us? And I'm like, well, you really set a policy that you can imagine a high school dropout from Mississippi would think that, why are you making my daughter mask? Like, that's just pretty stupid. And then they're napping. The CDC says we have to do it. How will people judge you if you set such a clearly I call some of these policies trust shredders. Like, if you set that policy that's so counter to just basic common sense, you will shred all the trust you have. And, I'm not going to blame people for not trusting you again.
And I assume you have nothing against Mississippi, and you only use that example because their education and test scores are not the highest. Why did you pick Mississippi?
No, I have nothing against Mississippi, but yeah, I mean, just a place where I think they have a lot of college dropouts, but that's okay. Yeah, I'm from Indiana. Listen, nothing. Indiana's got a lot of college dropouts, or high school dropouts too.
Let's talk about a new study that came out on side effects of the vaccine, which is sort of the flip side of some of this. There's an efficacy question, then there's a question about the dangers from the vaccine itself. So this study that we're going to talk about had a pretty large sample. 99 million. Like, that's a dream come true. Like, if there's anything bad about these vaccines, surely we're going to find it. And what was the bottom line of that study, and why are you skeptical of it?
Well, I should say that I want to commend the researchers for doing that. I think it's an important step, and I think that I did learn a lot of things by reading that study. This study comes out in the journal Vaccine. It's a very large analysis. Its basic method is simple. They look at the rates of certain conditions. I think something like 30 or 40 things they think might be linked to vaccine in the time period before vaccination, and then they look at it after people get vaccinated to see if there's an increase in that after vaccination, comparing it to sort of a baseline rate of these events. And what they found was, I think, lots and lots of potentially concerning safety signals. Of course, the things we know about, the heart inflammation or myocarditis, they found that signal. They found blood clots, which are linked to Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, the adenoviral vector vaccines. They found things that people were a little bit concerned might be linked, but we didn't have really a lot of proof that they were linked, like low platelets or immune thrombocytopenia purpura, low blood counts of one of the clotting factors. And then they found, a whole bunch of other things that were linked, including a demyelinating disease that affects kids, febrile seizures, a whole bunch of other concerning safety signals. Now, some of the points I want to make are, number one, the authors think their method is not biased by reporting. I think it is biased by reporting. It's an underestimate. And here, let me explain why. Sample size is brilliant. It's a huge sample. And I think they're pretty good about knowing whether or not somebody got vaccinated and when they got vaccinated. I think that's a pretty rock solid data point. But one of the data points that I think is weaker is the event itself. If you come in with low platelets, or you come in with abdominal pain, and that's due to a blood clot in the abdomen, it takes a lot before that's coded in the chart as mesenteric vein thrombo, a mesenteric artery thrombus, or like a clot in that artery. What does it take? It takes the doctor being like, oh boy, maybe something's going on here. The doctor has to order the CT scan. CT scan has to show the result. The result has to be coded in the chart and under like an ICD-10 coder, an electronic medical record code. There's lots of reasons to worry that wasn't really done so well. A young person comes in with belly pain. It's easy to say, we looked for some basic things, but maybe it's just minor. It'll feel better in a day. And you might miss a blood clot that was there, for instance, and that doesn't get coded in the chart. And one can start to think about all the other things. If it affects populations you're normally not looking for those kind of safety signals in, you might not be diagnosing it. You might not be coding it correctly. I think people who do electronic medical record research know that these data sets are often full of, missing data, and they're really not robust. So I say all that to say, I worry that in some cases, the safety signal, in other words, that the risk of these products is actually much bigger than what these researchers found. I think that's the direction I would worry more in. And then the final point I'd say, the reason this whole paper gets me, interested and concerned is, I think public health has to admit that there were some populations that were harmed as a result of vaccination. For instance, pushing AstraZeneca vaccines in 18-year-old women in 2021, which was done across Europe, resulted in some women getting cerebral vein thrombus in the brain and having brain herniation and dying, and some women getting blood clots. To me, it's hard to believe, even a little bit of safety signal in an 18-year-old, healthy 18-year-old may offset any potential benefit of that AstraZeneca vaccine in that 18-year-old, because the risk of COVID and bad outcomes from COVID was so low in that 18-year-old already. And we have proven mathematically that for a man who's 20 years old, dose 2 is harmful. I mean, he's going to get COVID either way. He's going to have some risk of COVID outcomes either way. But the risk of myocarditis is so much worse than the risk of bad COVID outcomes that you should not be giving him more doses. And And I think people who had COVID and recovered from COVID, many of them were harmed by getting vaccines. What I mean here is mathematically, in aggregate, there was a net harm to that group. Not that they're anecdotal stories of harm, which could be acceptable if there was a net benefit to the whole group. Now, why is this important? I think this is one thing that public health refuses to admit. They refuse to admit that any of our vaccine policies and mandates actually harmed a subpopulation of people. They come up with elaborate studies that they keep saying that, oh, well, COVID-19 is worse than the vaccine. Those studies are so catastrophically flawed, and they should know it. And I just want, maybe I'll talk about that for 1 second, why those studies are flawed. Like, if you want to know how often does a vaccine cause myocarditis, we can look at the record and say everyone who got a vaccine and how many people got myocarditis. Like, you could do that kind of math. If you want to know how often does COVID cause myocarditis, the question is, who had COVID in the data set? If you look at electronic health records in the United States, some people had COVID, but some people didn't have COVID. But among the people who don't have COVID in the record, many of them actually had COVID. Because how does it capture COVID in that data set? In order to be in the data set as COVID, you had to be so sick from COVID, you came to the doctor, they swabbed you and put it in their computer. But most of us either had it mild, we didn't test ourselves, or we tested at home and threw away the test, and that's not in their data set. So the denominator is not all COVID-19 infections, but the worst of the worst COVID-19 infections, those that warrant medical care. And then the numerator is how many people get myocarditis or whatever from that. And they compare that against the denominator of everyone who got the vaccine and how many get myocarditis. And to me, that's such a flawed comparison. You obviously are missing the majority of COVID-19 that didn't do harmful things because those people didn't come to the hospital, right? And so to me, I think a lot of that literature is flawed. And it is clear to me that it was a net harm in young men, particularly.
So this true story, it happened to me. I moved to Israel. Before I moved here, I got my two Moderna. No, yeah, I got two Moderna shots. And then I was going to get when I came here, everyone said you should get a booster. You should get a third one. And so I went to my health clinic, and they didn't have Moderna. They had Pfizer. And that alarmed me greatly. So while they were preparing me to be vaccinated, I'm desperately on my phone trying to find out if it's okay to get a booster of Pfizer on top of Moderna. I did it. I didn't die. I didn't die in the office, and I didn't die in the aftermath of the office. So I've had, at that point, 3 COVID-19 vaccines. So I'm at a party, and someone asked me if I've been boosted, and I said, yeah. And they said, how many times? I said, well, I've had 3 shots. And then they said, are you going to get another one? Because a lot of people said you should get one every once in a while. And I said, no, I'm not. And he said, why not? And I said, I don't know. It just seems like we don't know a lot about what this vaccine does in the long run to one's autoimmune system. And we're playing around with my body. My body's a complicated, highly, it's a well-oiled machine, of course, and a tremendously impressive thing. But I said, I just don't think at this point, COVID risk seems very small. The risk of dying from it seems very small. And he looked at me and he said, I think you're letting your political views get in the way of your common sense. And I'm proud to say that had it been 10 years before that, I think I would have gone berserk. I just looked at him and I just said, you don't know me very well. Let's just leave it at that. That he thought that my disinterest in a booster was because I was pro-Trump, for example, as opposed to anti-risk, anti-downside risk was almost amusing. It was not it took some effort to not get upset. But I'm curious what you think we know, if anything, about both long COVID, which very early on got scare stories in the paper, or that people with COVID, their lungs were never the same, and so on, and long impacts of the vaccine, especially people who are getting boosted over and over again. Do we know anything about either of those that's reliable?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess I'd say, maybe for a second, I just want to say my medical philosophy, which is pre-COVID, because I think it goes to your point, Russ, which was that I think for those of us who practice medicine, we imagine there's sort of a continuum of patients, people you see. We see some healthy people, and I'm a cancer doctor. I see people who are nearing the end of life with cancer that's relapsed many, many times. And we have different appetite to try things, I think, based on the person in front of us. If somebody comes into my office and they have multiple myeloma and they have progressed through 4 different prior therapies and their cancer is getting worse, and they say, doctor, I'm getting tired every day and my blood counts are taking off. I mean, this cancer is going to kill me. Can we try? And then, you name the drug. We try some new drug that has, an uncontrolled study of 20 people and some people felt a little bit better. Can we try this new drug? I think I would, and most cancer doctors would say, that's a reasonable, we don't know everything about that drug. We don't know for sure it's going to benefit you, but we know that this disease has taken off and you've tried everything that works. And it's we either try this or we're going to watch you die, So I think we have an appetite for risk and uncertainty in a very sick person. Now, as you go down that continuum, newly diagnosed myeloma, the FDA has just had a new statement saying they're going to tolerate more risk. But I say, this is a condition where the median survival is 15 years. Do you really want to risk getting a drug that could cause nerve damage or Parkinsonism? The risk benefit becomes more uncertain. I think you're more likely to be precautious and say, less medicines is better. Let's go with what's tried and true. You can reserve those sort of unproven things for later if you need it. So we have different attitudes. I think there's some disagreement there. But with healthy people who come in your office, they feel totally fine. They say, I'm totally fine. But is there a way you can make me better off? I think my attitude in medicine has always been extreme skepticism, there's a really extreme conservatism in the sense that you really need a lot of evidence before you start mucking with them, before you say, well, you ought to take this medicine or that medicine. Why? Because they're healthy. The odds are in their favor, and what's the evidence you have that you're really making them better off? That's one. Two, throughout most of history, most of the things we did to healthy people that we thought made them better off, made them a lot worse off. A healthy kid with acne, we radiate the face. And okay, well, now they got a lot of cancers. We did so many horrible, barbaric things, not understanding safety, not understanding what we were really doing. We did radiate acne. In this country, a lot of people had radiation to the face for acne, but it worked a little bit in the short term. So you start to get that. So that's my background coming into it. And I view myself as a healthy young person. I would say that I personally am extremely reluctant to take medicines and do medical procedures unless it's proven to benefit me. Now, back to your question. I think that's exactly how I feel about dose after dose of the COVID-19 shot, which is that if we wanted to know the answer, we could ask Pfizer and Moderna, who have earned $100 billion from these products, hey, run a 100,000 person randomized study each year, look for severe disease and death, look at all these outcomes, and let's see if dose 9 versus the prior 8 doses, the ninth dose has an additional benefit. Let's see, does it vary if you're in a nursing home and you're 80 versus if you're 60 and you're walking around? Does it vary if you're 20? We can make them do these studies. The US FDA has repeatedly, I think, abdicated that responsibility and omitted those studies. And if anything, the level of evidence for the ninth dose is much less than the level of evidence for the first dose. They actually did do a randomized study back then. Now they do it based on antibody data and sort of a lot of speculation. So my view is, and this has nothing to do with politics, this is my view in medicine long before the pandemic, which is that the bar for dosing healthy people has to be high. And certainly I think year after year boosters do not meet that bar. And I've written some essays saying that I'm not going to get another one until you prove it to me that it benefits me. And I think that has nothing to do with politics. Okay. Now, the next part of your question, go ahead. You want to talk about that? Yeah.
No,
the next
ahead.
part of your question was long COVID and long side effects. I think, it's going to be very difficult on all these topics. Long COVID, there's a lot to unpack there. I think it means many different things. If you get so sick with COVID, you come in the hospital and we have to put a breathing tube down your throat and ventilate you. I have no doubt in my mind that the path to recovery is not going to be easy. It's not going to be linear. It's going to take a long time. And we have long seen people really sick with any respiratory infection like influenza or even some of the older sort of respiratory viruses have a long path to feeling recovered. Or some of them may never feel the same after being on the vent for a couple of weeks. To me, the unique thing about when people say long COVID is some people believe you can have asymptomatic or very mild COVID-19 it's very mild, it's like a cold, but then 4 weeks later you have a brain fog or you feel fatigued all the time, and that's a sequela of the COVID-19. I think that's a very bold claim, and I think that's a claim that is disputed. I think that some people believe that you certainly feel that way. You feel very fatigued. You feel brain fog. I'm not sure it's attributable to the COVID-19. Some longitudinal studies say that the people more likely to experience it, it's linked more closely to personality traits like neuroticism or anxiety, underlying anxiety or depression at baseline. Just like among people who herniate a disc in the back, some people have persistent back pain, some people don't. It's not as always linked to the anatomic characteristic, but sometimes social support and, because pain is a combination of mind and body. So that to me is always the question with COVID-19. So insofar as the vaccines in first quarter of 2021 prevented severe disease, I believe they did, then I believe that they did reduce the number of people who have the disability after being on the ventilator because they produce people on the ventilator. But insofar as people think the vaccines lower your risk of having brain fog when you get a cold in 2026, I think that's entirely unproven, and I personally am skeptical of that claim. And so I've never seen any data to support that claim, and I wouldn't be getting a shot because I'm worried about brain fog in 2027 from getting a cold in 2026, for instance. In terms of long vaccine side effects, I think these mRNA vaccines, every single time you dose a man, there's a risk of myocarditis. It's about 1 in 10,000 for the third dose, 1 in 3,000 for the second dose. It never goes to zero. And so I do worry that with added dose after dose after dose, at some point that benefit harm balance is going to, I think it's already tipped for 20-year-old men, but for 40-year-old men, it's going to tip too. And 50-year-old men, it's going to tip as well. Then the final point, why is the global vaccination, or at least the US vaccination policy, I would say the US, why does the US vaccination policy have the exact same recommendation for somebody who's had COVID twice versus somebody who's never had COVID-19? And Paul Offit, the vaccinologist, was interviewed about this, and he said that when the Biden administration took office, there was a private vote of 5 scientists, and the vote was 3-2, and the vote was 3 in favor of saying they should have the same policy, and 2 against saying they should have a different policy accounting for some immunity from having had the virus. We know very clearly that people who've had and recovered from COVID-19 will definitely get COVID again, but they're not going to get severe disease and death nearly at the same frequency as they would have, prior to, being unimmune. And that's the question here. Does the vaccine provide a further reduction in severe disease or death beyond the protection you get from having survived it once? And I think that 3-2 vote was wrong. I think they got it wrong. The 2 people in dissent were right. But to me, what's most concerning is that a private vote among 5 people in the administration has set a policy that has such sweeping implications. Literally, this policy meant there are nurses in the United States who are fired from their jobs. There are people laid off from work. People had to change the sector of employment. We forced college students to get this. We threw kids out of college if they didn't do this. I mean, we have a professor at University of California System who was fired because he didn't want to. Aaron Caretti was fired as a professor of bioethics, of all things, because he didn't want to do it because he'd had COVID-19. So you're setting a policy that's really ruining the lives of people. It's not conferring the externality of benefit to third parties because it doesn't stop transmission. And it's based on a 3-2 vote among people who are really kind of guessing. That to me is a problem. And that to me is part of what I talk about in the essay about how could something that's scientifically so, impressive be bungled? And the last thing I'd say is you talk about mistrust. I mean, every piece of data we have right now shows Americans are not vaccinating their kids for measles, mumps, and rubella like they did before. I mean, everything is plummeting. Vaccines are plummeting. Trust in expertise is plummeting. Trust in science is plummeting. You mentioned a couple of times, what if there's a next pandemic? If there's a next pandemic in the next few years, I think America will tear itself in half. There is so much distrust of the expert community, so much deep distrust. And I think most of it is well-earned distrust. I tried to tell him not to mask the 2-year-olds. That's going to backfire. I tried to tell him, okay. But it's such deep distrust that if we have H5N1 spread, avian flu spread, for instance, I think literally half this country is going to do one thing and the other half is going to do the exact opposite. And I think there's going to be people moving states and massive upheaval. And I think if people start to use the police state to enforce things like mask compliance, try to arrest somebody who's not wearing a mask or something like that, there'll be violence. I think it's a pressure cooker situation. And as easy as it is for the government to point the finger and say, well, it's Joe Rogan out there, it's all the misinformation spreaders who created this distrust. I think they have to look inward. They are largely responsible from bad policy decisions, firing nurses who got COVID-19, forcing college kids to boost, making babies wear masks. Those decisions undermined their entire credibility and moral standing. And I think they did it to themselves, in my opinion.
There's a book by Gary Greenberg, which I love. I've interviewed Gary a couple of times, and I don't think I've interviewed him explicitly on the book, although issues from the book came up. It's called The Noble Lie. And it's a different perspective on the human proclivity to take a strong position, sometimes in the face of evidence to the contrary, in the name of a higher good. So, for example, I think we talk disparagingly of people who may have responded to financial incentives, but I think for some folks who were, quote, pro-vaccine long into the pandemic and long after maybe it was a wise idea for many populations, they would say to you, I think, in a quiet conversation, maybe not for public record, that, well, there's this anti-vaccine movement out there, so I'm always going to exaggerate the benefits of vaccines because I need to fight that dishonest view on the other side. And I just want to make the argument, it's actually, and I think in The Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith, it's such a dangerous, slippery slope. It's really much better to advocate for the truth. And although the noble lie is always tempting, one of the worst parts of it, I think, is convincing yourself that your motivation is good. And especially in times when it may have more complicated drivers. But certainly this loss of trust, which is happening in all kinds of aspects of I think, modern life, is it's just a devastating loss of ease by which we can make decisions. And we find ourselves at sea relying on sources that are often not true. So comment on that.
No, that's so well put. I mean, I think that you are absolutely spot on that many people are exaggerating, either saying things like, "Oh, well, this is we know it to be completely safe." COVID's going to be worse for you anyway. They say those things, and one of their justifications is that, well, the other side is saying things that are not true. So I have to lean in. I have to exaggerate a little bit to just sort of balance that out. And to me, that's sort of absolutely unacceptable as a scientist and as somebody who cares about reason and truth, where I think, again, no matter what anyone else is doing, you have to keep a laser focus on what the truth is, what you believe the truth is, how to articulate it best. And sometimes what that means is, it's easy to be a doctor and in January of 2020, tweet a picture of you rolling up your sleeve and say, "Hey, listen, I'm only, I'm 27 too, and I'm getting the shot. You get one too." But the truth is, really, there was a lot of ambiguity around that decision, particularly for people that had COVID. It would be much better to focus on the things we know with some confidence or certainty, that older people should get it first, and then to acknowledge that, if you're 27, maybe it's reasonable to do it, but don't feel too much pressure. We can hold off a little bit. To me, it's always better to pursue the truth doggedly. I think I do hope it eventually wins out. I worry with COVID-19 that I do worry it may not win out ultimately. I think that I just think one point. Many of the people who got the policy decisions wrong are winning all the national awards, and that concerns me. I mean, it concerns me to see, the FDA commissioner, who I think made a lot of mistakes, winning an award for the American College of Cardiology for evidence-based public practice, which I think he did a weak job of. I think that we didn't even talk about, but there's been a lot of concerning revelations about what the scientists believed about the origin of the virus. Did it come from the lab or not? The House committee is investigating. They find emails and Slack messages from these scientists privately acknowledging massive uncertainty, while publicly they're saying absolutely not 100% natural origin, but privately they're saying, we don't know, but we can't tell that to them. And that is absolutely devastating and absolutely unacceptable. So to me, I feel like I'm not sure what will happen. Places like the National Academies of Medicine are I think they would probably disagree with some of my stance. And they're certainly rewarding people who were pro-school closure, pro-masking kids, pro-mandatory boosters of 20-year-old people who had COVID. Those people are winning the awards. And so that to me suggests that we're not ready for an honest reflection, at least in the academy, which I think is the academy and the public in America, I think, are almost entirely separate now. There's two groups of people who are not talking to each other. And I think a lot of my professor colleagues do not have their finger on the pulse of what the average American thinks or feels. And I think to their detriment, they're going to make some big policy errors in the future.
I should have asked you before. I don't know if I've ever asked you. Are you vaccinated?
Oh yeah, well, of course. My personal decision was the first dose. I think at the time I was maybe 36 or something, and I had never had COVID-19. I was very interested in getting dose one of the vaccine, and I ran out and got dose one of the vaccine. And I was reading the observational data showing like dose one already gives you like 94% of the reduction in severe hospitalization, at least in a couple of nice New England Journal papers. I also had tons of side effects from dose one. Like I felt wrecked, my arm, pins and needles in the arm, and it lasted for so long. So I was extremely reluctant to get dose two. I also knew that the timing of the two doses, which were 21 days apart for Pfizer and 28 days for Moderna, I knew that was arbitrary. That was created merely to get the trial to complete in a tight timetable. And immunologically, spreading the two doses further apart would be much more reasonable. And that's what they did in the United Kingdom, of course, to their credit. So I did not get dose two on schedule. I dragged my feet, and I only got dose two many months later when I received an email saying that I would be fired as a professor if I didn't get dose two. Then I got dose two. And then a few months after that, I wasn't going to get dose three. But then I got an email saying I would be fired on Monday if I didn't get dose three. So I got dose three. And some people criticized me saying, well, if you really believed in your principles, you let them fire you. I said, are you out of your mind? That's ridiculous. I take Advil one day. And I mean, look, I'm concerned about safety signals, but let's keep it in perspective. To be a doctor in America, you certainly had to do more than one day of misery in your life. It's a big sacrifice. I'm not going to give that up over one little shot. I'm going to suck it up, take some Advil, take the shot, and get back to work. And then beat them in the long game, which is changing, I think, the attitudes of people around their error in their policy. So then after 3 doses, then now, of course, they've given up. They threw in the towel. They stopped. I mean, they couldn't mandate it anymore. I think there's enough faculty member who would revolt. And so we're in a detente. The university has thrown in the towel. Unfortunately, people like Aaron Caretti, he was fired. He's not been rehired. I think that's an embarrassment for the University of California system. To fire, by all accounts, he was a professor that students loved. He's a nice guy. He had COVID, recovered from COVID. In my mind, and also that's another point we want to make. You can have a mandate, but what should the penalty be? I mean, if you go back to some of the original mandates around vaccination, the penalty was a fine, $100, $200, there's some penalty. Should the penalty be loss of employment and a prohibition on employment in that entire sector for perpetuity? Should you get the death penalty for not getting this vaccine? And I think many people did get a death penalty because they still can't get rehired by hospitals that still have the mandate. Now, a lot of hospitals in particularly Republican areas are removing the mandate so they can hire these people back. But 3 years of loss of employment for not doing this, I'm not sure we're helping people. I mean, that's in my opinion, a death penalty. So I think penalties should be proportionate to the evidence as well. And that's a longstanding principle of public health ethics. And it was entire overkill. So, maybe you should have fined him $500, fine, something like that, something that we can agree on to deter, but what they did, I think, was unjustified.
So let's close. You wrote a book a while back with Adam Sifu, another EconTalk guest, called Medical Reversal. I happened to interview Adam about the book, not you. And in that conversation, we talked about how vertebroplasty, the injection of cement into the spine after a fracture into the vertebrae of the back, is actually no better than the placebo of opening the can of cement, letting the person smell it. And in a recent episode, I revealed how, faced with this decision for my mom, who'd fallen she's 91, had a compression fracture. She tried the wearing a brace, unbelievably uncomfortable, realized that was not going to be a feasible solution. I didn't think I could talk the doctor into trying the placebo effect and opening the can of cement or the tube of cement as a non-intervention, non-invasive treatment. He did the treatment. She's 100% pain-free. But as an economist, helping my mom face that decision with my siblings, I went against the so-called literature of this technique that seems to bring relief, but when tested in a clinical trial, did not, at least against this placebo. But it highlighted, forget whether that's the right decision or not. I think what's interesting is how hard it is to make decisions in these kind of areas. And we have this, you and I are talking about vaccination and how many to get and whether to get it and what policy should be. But the fact is, we have a lot of evidence and we still have a lot of uncertainty. So what's your reaction to that story about my mom and the general kind of issues about so-called, the gold standard of the randomized control trial to finally establish whether vertebroplasty works versus the uncertainty we face in these kind of decisions that probably can't be totally removed ever.
Well, that's a great story. First of all, I'm glad to hear your mom is feeling better and doing well. That's the most important thing. And I think that's how your mom feels, how you feel. And I guess, I think one thing to say is that when we wrote about that in the book, which was written in 2015, we were talking about, I think 2 paired studies in the New England Journal in 2009, and they're exactly as you described, Russ. Prior studies had shown vertebroplasty was better than, say, doing nothing. But what happens if you randomize people to vertebroplasty, where you open this polyacrylamide cement and inject it into the fracture, versus you take them to the room, the procedure room, you open the cement, you let them breathe that sort of acetone smell, that nail polish smell, then you throw it away and just inject some saline or don't do it at all. And the answer was both groups felt better. And so it was really sort of a placebo effect. That's what those papers showed. Now, one thing I should say is that one possibility is that since those papers were done, maybe these interventional radiologists have invented some new cement or new needle technique that is actually better. And so I think that one thing to always admit is that perhaps a larger placebo-controlled trial done next week might actually be positive. So I don't know, so I'm open to that possibility. I do think that if they're going to do it and make money from it, that they should have some obligation to generate that evidence or not have it paid for. The next thing I would say is that this is so true for everybody, which is the beauty of that thing was that people on the control arm actually also felt better. People who didn't get it done, there were many people who said their pain went to 0 or they felt better. There's sort of a very famous story in medicine of the internal mammary artery ligation, which is an artery in the chest that doesn't go to the heart. And if you take people with anginal chest pain, which is sort of chest pain caused by blockages in the arteries of the heart, in the 1950s, they used to tie off this unrelated artery in the chest. And many people got off the table and said, "Doc, I feel great now." Then, of course, they did 2 sham controlled studies, randomized them to do it or say you did it and didn't do it. And both groups felt better. So placebo effect is powerful. It's real. Now, I think the real policy question is, well, should doctors actually do placebos? Probably through most of human healing, a lot of what counts as traditional medicines and ancient human healing arts is a placebo, an elaborate, put your hands on the patient, put them in a room, have some incense burning, creating this whole environment where you can sort of coax them into a more positive mental state. Should doctors do that? And I'm actually open to that as long as sort of 3 things are met. I think the use of the placebo is reasonable if you can do it in a way that's not deceiving. There are some randomized studies where you randomize people to placebo. You tell them it's placebo. The control arm is doing nothing, but they still feel better on placebo. This is an IBS study. It should be as non-invasive as possible, if possible, non-invasive, and minimize harms. And it shouldn't get in the way of some proven more effective alternative. So I think, there's a lot to be explored there. But, your mother's story, I think, is so telling. And I think what it reinforces is, there will always be more than brute force than randomized data to make these decisions. And ultimately, your mom doesn't care if it was placebo or not. She feels better, right? And that's, I think, one of the most interesting things about medicine.
Well, the thing I'll reveal about myself, I didn't reveal it in the last conversation that I talked about this on the program. When we were trying to make this tough decision, it made tougher by the fact that my mom's 91. Thank God she's mentally totally competent, but she didn't take as many statistics classes in nursing school as her son did, who's took econometrics. So in theory, I'm an expert who loves her, and I should make a really good informed decision on her behalf. But what I want to confess is when I was trying to make that decision, I thought, I wonder if that test, that control trial, I wonder if the 2 groups were really equally in extremis. Were they equally in pain? I mean, really, and surely there's some bias, publication bias of finding the placebo effect. And so I thought, that makes me want to err on the side of intervening and getting the cement. And by the way, this was, I have a doctor friend who does this procedure. He does it with local anesthetic. Her doctor, my mom's doctor, actually does it with general, which is just yet another reason not to do it because it's a much riskier intervention. But I managed to convince myself that the randomized control trial that was in your book probably wasn't as foolproof and ironclad as it might seem to be. And yet, I didn't look that study up. I did not give it a careful evaluation. I used my confirmation bias. I think that I wanted to intervene. I wanted to be helpful to her. I didn't want her to wear that brace. And if it, at worst, it would be the placebo effect, it was worth risking in the face of the general anesthesia risk. So I just want to confess that, even though I care deeply and often evaluate studies very aggressively for their reliability in this particular case, I didn't. So it tells you something about me and maybe about in general how there's a bias toward intervening versus not intervening.
I mean, I think I agree with you, Russ, and I agree with your reasoning, and I don't disagree. I guess the only thing I wonder is, should the manufacturer of that cement be able to charge $3,000 a vial? If you can get, that's the question, because we could do the same procedure and use saline. I mean, if it is in fact a placebo effect, how much should they get to charge for that cement? And then the next question is that, I mean, at the end of the day, in some ways, you did the right thing, because even at worst, it's placebo effect, she'll feel a little bit better. At best, there's some real effect. And, as long as the bill is not prohibitive to her or something like that, that's one of the interesting things about placebo. And thankfully, she didn't suffer any complications. So I think that's the way it could have gone wrong. The cement could have, gone somewhere it's not supposed to, and something bad could have happened. And I think that's one of the reasons why I always say that sometimes I wear my doctor hat and wear my policy hat. When I wear my policy hat, I sometimes say, this medicine, the data's so bad, we can't cover this medicine at this hospital. Then the patient's in your office, you wear your doctor hat, and you say, well, you know what? It's not my job right now to decide what we're paying for or not. It's already covered, and, they want to try it, and they know the uncertainty. We're going to try it, So I think sometimes we wear our sun hat, and I wear our econometrics hat.
My guest today has been Vinay Prasad. Vinay, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks for having me, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.